Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening and welcome to the program. Let's take a look at tonight's top stories. Here's what's coming up on the program. A radical proposal from the nation's most senior Greens minister calling on the Albanese government to enter into a formal power-sharing deal with the Greens and promote the likes of Adam Bandt to cabinet after the next election. Australia's rental crisis worsens as the Albanese government brings in record numbers of immigrants and state governments ramp up taxes for property investors. Latest polling from Queensland shows the Annastacia Palaszczuk government is likely to be defeated at next year's state election. We'll speak to our Queensland correspondent about the state's infrastructure and crime crisis. And later in the program, it will shine a light on the shocking pro-Palestine, pro-Hamas protests that have been held not just locally but across the world. And if you thought this was bad, wait until you see what happened in Dagestan overnight as anti-Semitic rioters stormed the airport looking for Jewish travellers to attack. Scary stuff. But first, I want to talk a little bit about so-called truth-telling, defamation, and a football club that is facing a seven-figure payout for facilitating both. The Hawthorn Football Club is going to pay dearly for the role it played in the vilification of three former employees, player development manager Jason Burt, Alistair Clarkson, who is now the senior coach at the Kangaroos, and Chris Fagan, who is now senior coach at the Lions. Now, this catastrophe began when Hawthorn appointed an activist to complete what it called a cultural safety review, what became known as the Racism Report, which was then leaked to the ABC. And so just a few days before last year's grand final, the national broadcaster broke a shocking story of racism at the Hawthorn Football Club. The ABC painted the three men as monsters responsible for racist bullying and human rights abuses. The rest of the media weren't far behind, all eager to outdo each other with reporting that often amounted to race-baiting hyperbole. Now, it's worth noting that this report was questionable from the start. Quite obviously, not a single non-Indigenous or non-Maori individual was even interviewed. It was an activist report seemingly designed to find racism, whether it existed or not, and that's precisely what it did. The result was utterly devastating for the three men who categorically denied the allegations, but that didn't matter. This was truth-telling, and to question it or even seek further information was monstrous.
But when three people have made similar accusations...
Well, there's five people, actually. Three
that
different
is true.
families, yeah. There's
That is
five
true.
people.
But the Indigenous community has been persecuted for so long. And this is yet another example of it. Yet we don't say, I'm concerned, I'm worried. These human beings have been violated.
Over at Channel 9, veteran reporter Caroline Wilson even attacked Alistair Clarkson for releasing a statement proclaiming his innocence. She said that was combative and ill-advised. She also wrote in The Age of Hawthorn's racist past and called what were untested, often self-serving allegations the greatest scandal to engulf the AFL. Really? Did we already forget about the Essendon fiasco? Now, Wilson also wrote this about Phil Egan, the activist Hawthorn had commissioned to complete the report. Only the unusual mixture of blunt but sensitive questioning undertaken by Egan and his team could have led to this. Phil Egan has since been hit with more than 70 criminal charges after a fraud investigation into his involvement with the Murray Valley Aboriginal Cooperative. Egan denies any wrongdoing and is innocent until proven guilty. That's how it's supposed to be in a civilised nation. But when it came to the former Hawthorn trio, there was no such restraint. All three were forced to take leave from their respective roles. And most footy pundits did not expect Clarkson and Fagan to return to their senior coaching roles, but the witch hunt wasn't restricted to the football media. We had Greens leader Adam Bant posting this. He said the reports of racist and sexist coercion at Hawthorn are sickening. ABC regular Jess Maguire joined in. She tweeted, "There is simply no way to justify any of Clarkson's behaviour. It's like a horror film." Any notion of due process was gone. The men were deemed guilty. The trio were repeatedly defamed as racists, bigots, bullies on social media, and the impact of that was devastating. For Alistair Clarkson, the stress became too much, and this year he was forced to again take leave from the game. Now, despite enormous pressure from the AFL, the men refused to come to some sort of a cushy deal and admit to being culturally insensitive to make this go away. They maintained their innocence, and in the end, the AFL's independent inquiry ended with no adverse findings against Alistair Clarkson, Chris Fagan or Jason Bird. Now, the Hawthorn Football Club faces a massive payout to Alistair Clarkson, who is exercising his legal options. The Hawks board and former president Jeff Kennett can say all they like about acting in good faith and following correct procedures, but they began this catastrophe by commissioning that flawed report and having Phil Egan complete it. It's little comfort to the three men whose good names were slandered far and wide that the club acted incompetently rather than with malice. Hawthorn's ineptness is not a defence. But there is a bigger lesson here. This is what happens when the onus of proof is reversed, when the notion of innocent until proven guilty is abandoned, and due process is seen as cruel or racist. Truth-telling cannot be a one-way street. Let's head to Canberra now for tonight's political headlines with Sky News political reporter Olivia Casely.
Good evening. 11th hour negotiations for a free trade agreement with the European Union have collapsed, pushing back expectations of a deal being struck until after Australia's next federal election. The Trade Minister flew to Osaka, Japan for special talks with the EU negotiators, but the deadlock couldn't be broken.
Unfortunately, we've not been able to make progress. Negotiations will continue, and I'm hopeful that one day we will sign a deal that benefits both Australia and our European friends.
The trading bloc of 445 million people want access to Australia's abundant critical minerals and rare earths. While Australia wants to export beef, sheep, dairy and sugar to Europe without such high quotas and tariffs. Another major sticking point is local farmers don't want to capitulate to European demands to give up naming rights for traditional delicacies like feta and prosecco.
We wanted to do a deal with the EU. We can see value in getting more access to such a large, high-value market, but we're not going to do it at any price. And the last thing we were prepared to do was to sell out Aussie farmers just for the sake of a deal.
EU officials were said to be surprised the Australian government turned down their offer, but the opposition supports the government's hardball strategy.
The European Union has been very disappointing with what that offered Australia, and they didn't deserve a deal with us.
Chinese President Xi Jinping is expected to ask Anthony Albanese to support his country's CPTPP bid, as well as dilute security coordination with the United States and the Indo-Pacific during his trip to Beijing. Allowing China to enter the CPTPP trade bloc would require Canberra isolating Tokyo, its closest regional partner. Such a move is unlikely given China's economic coercion. Anthony Albanese will be the first Quad or AUKUS leader to visit China since 2019. Qantas has denied breaking the law or benefiting financially when it sold tickets on already cancelled flights last year. The ACCC filed a lawsuit in the federal court in late August against the airline. It's accusing Qantas of deceptive conduct when it advertised more than 8,000 tickets it had already cancelled. Qantas accepts they have let their customers down, but reject fees for no service allegations made by the consumer watchdog.
Now, I want to start with the PM. I'm going to be speaking to Dennis Shanahan now. Dennis, let's start with the PM, who is really earning his Airbus Albo nickname. Let me explain why. Since becoming Prime Minister around 18 months ago, Anthony Albanese has travelled right across the world. We've had him in Jakarta, to Paris, to London, to Fiji, San Diego, Lithuania. In fact, around 20 trips, not bad for such a short period. Next step on his world tour is Beijing. Dennis Shanahan, tell me, he seems to be a lot happier when he's out of the country. Now, I know it's important for him to meet with our allies and meet with foreign leaders, but we are in a cost of living crisis and the Prime Minister seems to be removed from that battle.
Look, I've always defended Prime Ministers who travel. They have to travel to so many of these meetings, and there are now so many more meetings, the G20 and APEC and ASEAN, CHOGM even. So there are all sorts of meetings that have to occur, and they occur during the summit season, September, October, and so that means Prime Ministers have to travel a great deal. There's no doubt that Anthony Albanese looks happy when he's overseas. He went to Japan within 48 hours of becoming Prime Minister. He had to go, but he does look happy on the world stage. His problem is that by looking happy, people are saying, what about what is happening back here where you're in Washington or London or wherever? What about us? And there are two problems here. One, that whenever a Prime Minister travels during hard times, it looks bad. He can't do anything. He can say it's hard work as many times as he likes, but it doesn't cut through. You know, he's going to an official dinner at the White House. It's very hard to make that look like hard work. I've attended a few, and it's not really hard work. It is quite a sumptuous time. So they are the appearances of what's happening. The other problem that he has is he has to come back from these trips with something to say, well, that's why I actually went to the United States. I've come back and here are these job-creating opportunities. The other problem he's got, and this is something that comes from his own domestic media management, is that when he's overseas, he tries to control questions from the media, even from the US media on this trip, where they are asking about things which are occurring in Australia. And so they really think that it's all about what he's doing. And I think that this is his problem, that he has to try and address all these domestic issues while he is travelling, trying to do so and say, no, invoking the so-called London Convention that Bob Hawke just invented for a very short time. He has to actually, when he's overseas, talk about what is happening in Australia. He also, I think, has to start to consider thinking, well, maybe we should have Parliament sitting when he's travelling and have Richard Marles, who did quite a good job the other day as acting Prime Minister, because there is so much travel and the Prime Minister can't expect to do this without trying to talk about what is happening in Australia. And these are big issues in Australia. And at the moment, the trips he's been on haven't actually contributed to lifting the cost of living pressures or contributing to large numbers of new jobs in Australia.
Now, the Albanese government has abstained from a UN vote calling for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. The move has sparked backlash on both sides. The Muslim community says the PM is supporting war over peace. But we've also got the Jewish community who's deeply unhappy with this, Dennis. The government didn't back the US and Israel, which voted against the motion. What are your thoughts on Australia abstaining here?
Well, of course, the Labor Party's policy on the Middle East has changed. It happened at the National Conference earlier this year. And so there is now a different attitude towards Israel and the occupied territories. Now, what is happening within the government The real problem for Anthony Albanese is not so much the abstention at the UN. The UK also abstained. And there is an argument here that, should we have gone with the US, particularly while Anthony Albanese was there having a big dinner with President Biden. And so there is an argument that we should have stood more clearly with Israel. But the UK didn't. They abstained the same. The real problem on the Middle East at the moment is the mixed messaging coming from senior ministers within the Albanese government. Anthony Albanese has been saying all the right things while he's been in Washington to Joe Biden about Israel and the terrorist attack from Hamas and the protection of civilian lives, all civilian lives. But the problem he's got is that he has very senior ministers back in Australia giving out different signals, refusing to condemn claims of genocide, making claims of war crimes against Israel, and even suggesting in a transcript which wasn't fully released until later that there are civilian murders occurring on both sides. This isn't civilian casualties. The word is murders, and that includes Palestinians. Now, there are clearly civilian Palestinian deaths, and that is because that's what Hamas is trading on. That is what Hamas is using. This is an extremely difficult position to be in, but I'm afraid that the Australian government can't have it two ways. We have been a long friend of Israel. This was a massive terrorist attack. It was mass murder terrorist attack on Israelis. They are trying to limit civilian casualties, but that is also the point, that Hamas has wanted to limit Israel's retaliation by the use effectively, not just of Israeli hostages, including babies, but Hamas, Palestinian civilians. So this is a very difficult time, and having mixed messages about or a moral equivalence towards Israel and Hamas is not going to work politically or morally for the government.
Well said. Now, we've had all of Australia's living prime ministers, except Paul Keating, expressing their support for Israel and calling for solidarity with Jewish Australians in a rare statement. That was wonderful to see. But I do want to move on to another issue. I'll be speaking to David Adler later in the program about what's happening in Israel. But ACT Greens leader and Attorney General Shane Rattenbury has called on the Prime Minister to enter into a formal coalition with the Greens. The coalition would include promoting Greens MPs to cabinet. Oh, goodness me. Can you imagine Trade Minister Adam Bant, or maybe you can put him in charge of energy? Dennis, that would be scary, scary stuff. This would be a proposal for the next election if Anthony Albanese were in minority government.
Well, I don't think Anthony Albanese wants a Andrew Barr of it, if I could put it that way. They don't want to signal that they will go into a formal agreement with the Greens, but there is a much greater chance now of Labor going into minority government, and that gives the Greens, federal level and obviously at the ACT level, a much greater opportunity to claim that they should be working with Labor and, of course, ensuring their own survival and their own sense of power. I don't think it will happen. There won't be a formal arrangement before the next election, but we have seen joint elections and governments in Tasmania and the ACT, and the Greens want to spread their influence.
Dennis Shanahan, thank you so much for your time. And some would say that there has been an unofficial alliance there for some time. Labor would not be getting elected without those Greens preferences. Always a pleasure, Dennis. Thank you.
Thanks.
Now I want to go to Australia's rental crisis, which only appears to be getting worse as the Albanese government continues to bring in record numbers of migrants. New analysis from PropTrack has found the number of new rental listings fell 5.7% in the year to September. As a result of the supply crunch, the national median weekly rent for advertised properties at the end of September was $550 a week. Now that's up 14.6% compared with this time last year. Joining me to discuss this is Chief Economist of Macro Business, Leith Van Onselen. Leith, thank you so much for your time. Rental listings are down, rents are way up, and Leith, it's not hard to see why when we're bringing in such an enormous number of people. 715,000 Labor are planning to bring in the past financial year and this one.
Yeah, and actually those numbers, Rita, are running well beyond that. The latest monthly visa data from the Department of Home Affairs is an absolute shocker. And it showed that the number of temporary visa holders, that's excluding visitors, in Australia actually ballooned by 600,000 people in the year to September. And that was driven by, so there's basically 2.3 million temporary visa holders in Australia. That's if you exclude holiday makers right now, which means that basically 1 in 11 people in the country right now are on a temporary visa. And this has been driven by, obviously international students, which went up by 300,000. Temporary graduate visas went up by about 100,000 and employment visas went up by about 200,000. So the numbers are off the charts, and this has been obviously reflected in the rental market. We've got rental vacancy rates at all-time low levels. We've got double-digit rental growth across the capital cities, record low rental listings. And unfortunately, the situation is going to get worse, not just because obviously the government's ramping immigration to levels we've never seen before, but also because housing construction is actually collapsing at the same time. So only 170,000 net homes were supplied last financial year, 2022-2023, and that's against a population increase of 626,000. And pretty much the housing supply last year was already 70,000 below the 1.2 million homes target, which requires 240,000 people a year. So we're way beyond, way below that. And the problem is all the forward-looking indicators, whether you look at new home sales, dwelling approvals or loans for, housing construction, are all around decade lows. So we've got this unbelievable imbalance between demand through immigration and supply. And the rental crisis is just going to keep getting worse unless the Albanese government cuts immigration. It's as simple as that.
Well, they don't look like they're going to do that because they're hooked on any sort of economic activity that might bring. And as far as landlords, investors go, on top of all the interest rate hikes, they've got other issues. Your mum and dad property investors are dealing with state governments that are also hooked on property taxes. The situation's particularly grim in Victoria with land tax rates skyrocketing, and where 1 in 4 Melbourne landlords sold their home last year, sold their investment last year. So how much is that a factor in scaring off potential property investors? They look at the renters' rights, the changes to the legislations, the land tax, and, it might be a lot easier to put your money in the share market.
Yeah, I mean, it's not as much of a problem in the established market, because if an investor sells, they're going to sell obviously to a first home buyer or another investor, for example. So you don't actually get a reduction in supply. It's just basically a transfer from investor to a first home buyer. But the big problem is obviously if investors abandon the new home market, and that's obviously creating new supply. So if they abandon that because of all these changes, that's just going to smash the supply side even more, which has already been smashed obviously by record numbers of builder failures. We've got, sky high materials costs, and also obviously interest rates are at high levels and probably likely to go higher from here. So the supply side of the housing market is completely stuffed. And this is occurring at the same time as obviously there's a record population growth. So it's an absolutely diabolical situation the housing market and renters are facing.
Absolutely stuffed seems to be a very apt summary indeed. In fact, Simon Presley, who's one of Australia's most respected buyers advocates, he announced recently that his firm would no longer recommend any Victorian property to investors. I mean, that's how grim things are in this state. Hopefully the other states don't follow. Big news also leaked today with Qantas. The national carrier claims that the ACCC's case against it is ignoring the reality of the aviation industry, as airlines can't guarantee specific flight times. Qantas says that customers on cancelled flights were offered an alternative flight or refund, meaning there was no fee for no service, as the ACCC claims. Leith, this comes as several US mega funds declare they plan to deliver a strike against the Richard Goyder-led board and vote down several directors, including former advertising boss Todd Sampson. Goodness me, Leith, Alan Joyce may have left the building, but the drama continues.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, personally, I think Qantas needs an absolute clean out. Their behaviour pretty much since the pandemic and recently has been pretty poor. I know personal friends who've basically had their flights cancelled at the last minute. It's completely stuffed their holidays. And it's not an isolated example. These sorts of things happen across the board. Obviously, we've had all the travel credit dramas and everything else. And then, of course, obviously, its involvement in The Voice was a bit ridiculous as well. So, look, I think the whole airline does need a clean out, and I think that's a good thing. And also, I think the whole aviation industry in general needs more competition. I mean, we should be opening up flight routes, etc. Let them compete. Don't give them this sort of sheltered workshop, protection racket that's going on. So, I'm all for it. Clean them out. Take out the trash.
Leith Van Alstel, thank you so much for your time this evening.
Cheers, anytime.
Don't go anywhere. Coming up after the break, Daniel Wild and Keith Pitt join me on the panel to discuss everything from crime in Victoria to the ousting of Wallabies coach Eddie Jones. Welcome back. Now, big news over the weekend out of Rugby Australia after South Africa beat the All Blacks at the Rugby World Cup final. Wallabies coach Eddie Jones resigned, or was he pushed? He's faced a lot of criticism following the Wallabies' embarrassing losses to Fiji and Wales. Joining me to get the latest on all of this and much more is former Resources Minister and Queensland LNP member Keith Pitt and Deputy Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs, Daniel Wild. Gents, welcome. Now, I knew Eddie Jones was a poor appointment, Keith, as soon as I saw this endorsement from the always wrong Peter Pirate Fitzsimons, who said his appointment was an absolute masterstroke. It's ended in tears, Keith.
It has indeed. I didn't know the Pirate endorsed him, but there you go. Rita.
He did. He said he was a masterstroke. Yes.
Kids used to say they want to be a Wallaby. Now it's who wants to be a Wallaby. It has indeed. But, mate, I'm a rugby league fan. I stopped watching rugby union when everything was won by penalty kicks and drop kicks and no one was scoring any tries. And they're in real competition with the AFL and the NRL now. NRL's going to Los Angeles next year. That's a big coup for Peter V'landys and others. And the ARU, to be honest, they've just been left behind. So here's what was a long-term appointment, gone within months. Definitely not a success at the World Cup, and I think there's a lot of work to do.
Now, Jen, Senator Jacinta Price has described Indigenous leaders' response to the Voice referendum as cowardly. She says, in a cowardly letter to parliamentarians, they have tried to make this referendum result about rejection. But it isn't about rejection, is it, Daniel?
No, it's certainly not about rejection of Indigenous Australians. I think it was a rejection of the elites, you could say, in the governing class of this society that wanted to divide us by race. But clearly Australians said that, no, we're all equal, that we all deserve the same rights. And we know that Australians overwhelmingly voted no because they did not want our nation to be divided, and they wanted to have more practical outcomes for Indigenous Australians rather than fundamentally changing our constitution. And the other point, Rita, I think, is that the defeat of the Voice to Parliament was a victory for the Australian way of life, and it gives us a lot of hope. It reaffirms that mainstream Australians really value and cherish our democracy as it is. And I think it's just concerning, but also typical of some of those in the Yes campaign to say that this was about rejection because they just want to ignore the facts.
Keith, can we see a similar fight back from the coalition when it comes to other consequential issues? I don't know, like energy policy. That would be good to see, to give the Australian electorate an actual choice when they cast their vote. Because right now, despite what we hear about switching to nuclear and going down a more rational road, you guys are still signed up to net zero, just like Labor Party are.
Well, it's all about having a point of difference. And something I saw recently Rita, was a real change in social media content. And I don't know whether it's a trend or not. I was on that program on the ABC everyone tells me not to go on just a week or so ago. And the commentary was quite incredible around power prices, climate. Well, you've got to be in the field, mate. You can't abandon the field. And the commentary on social media, both Facebook and even Twitter, was incredibly supportive of doing things that get power prices down, stop doing things that cost an absolute fortune. There was real opposition to this mad charge to not even 2050, but now 2030, 2035. Imagine Adam Band as the Resources Minister, what he'd do to this country. And I think there's a real opportunity to be bold, and at the next election, that's something I'll certainly be pushing for.
Now, Daniel, the Victorian Police Association is concerned about public drunkenness, which will be decriminalised in Victoria on Melbourne Cup Day. What a day to introduce it. They say the government's failure to have a sobering up centre in Collingwood will see police being forced to walk away from helping those who are intoxicated in the street. We've also got the issues, obviously, in this city with a potential new drug injecting facility being open in the CBD. Daniel, what do you make of this, introducing this policy before their sobering up centre is even up and operational?
I think it's just another example of the toxic legacy of the Andrews government. And, so far the new Premier Jacinta Allen has not proven to be able to provide any alternative leadership. I mean, there was just today in the media, Rita, the discussion of the ongoing effects of lockdowns on far too many young Australians and young Victorians and the cost that that's imposed. And, this is another example of a short-sighted policy. The purpose of having public drunkenness as an offence was really to give police discretion to deal with, people that maybe aren't right now committing a crime and aren't a violent threat to somebody, but are well on the way to doing that, and they could sort of hold them for a period of time in the name of community safety. So I note that there's been a number of police who have said that they're concerned about losing some of that discretion, and I'm concerned that this could further increase the crime that we're already seeing on the ground throughout Melbourne.
Now, scary times around the world for Jewish people. This is just another example. This is an Oxford-educated Pakistani senator who posted this photo of Adolf Hitler on Twitter, adding the caption, "At least now the world knows why he did what he did." Shocking stuff, Keith. I mean, this is just another example of why we need to stand with Israel right now more than ever.
Hear, hear, Rita, hear, hear. If you try and erase our history of the world, if you try to forget history, well, you are bound to repeat it. And we are seeing now the results of what's been a long-term challenge in the Middle East. But never forget, never, ever forget, 1,400 people were murdered. It's like your neighbour jumping the fence and wiping out your family, then jumping back over and pointing fingers at you to say, well, there you go. These people are terrorists. They need to be found. They need to be brought to justice, and I think Israel will do that. I was disappointed in the position Australia took at the United Nations. We send people there to vote and hold a position. The PM was pretty clear, and I thought they should have been even clearer at the UN. And there's still time to address that and correct the record, and I think that's something the federal government should actually do.
Well, Peter Dunn spoke strongly about that today. That abstaining from that vote, I think, is going to be noticed in many places, including Israel. Now, recently we had pro-Palestinian and pro-Hamas protesters demonstrating outside the State Library in Melbourne just over the weekend, and they climbed up on a statue of Sir Redmond Barry, who was the first Solicitor General of Victoria and Chancellor of the University of Melbourne. You can see climbing all over the statue. Now, Keith, the same thing happened in London, and actor and commentator Lawrence Fox was not impressed. He did this in response.
Get your off my statues.
Well done!
Daniel, get your crap off my statues, off my monuments. I like seeing that. I mean, there should be some pride in these monuments. They should not be something for people to deface with whatever their cause is.
Oh, I completely agree, Rita, and it's refreshing and good to see that, but concerning at the same time to see the fracture in our society and the division that is being caused. And I think a lot of Australians are looking at what's been happening here and what's been happening around the Western world with deep concern. And I completely agree with what Keith said. We need to see a bit more leadership on the domestic front on this matter.
Dan Wild, Keith Pitt, thank you so much for your time this evening. Up next, it's not looking too good for Annastacia Palaszczuk. The latest polling shows Queenslanders will likely vote her out at the 2024 state election after 8 years of mismanagement. Welcome back. Now, I want to go to London, where we're joined by Federal Liberal National Member for Groom, Garth. Garth, welcome. You're there attending the ARC conference in London. But before we go to that, let's chat about what's happening in Queensland. And the poll numbers have come through. Right now, we've got wall-to-wall state Labor governments across the country, except for Tasmania, and we have Labor federally. But how long is that going to hold? This time next year, Queenslanders will be preparing to vote in a state election that will likely, according to the latest polling, turf Labor out. The latest YouGov poll shows that Annastacia Palaszczuk is no longer Queensland's preferred premier. That's for the first time in a long time. It shows that Palaszczuk's net satisfaction rating is now -20. It also showing that the coalition has extended its two-party lead over Labor to 52% to 48%. Of course, we're still a long way away, but why do you think the polls have turned against Annastacia Palaszczuk?
Well, I'm glad they have. They've been a long time coming. I think it's taken a while for us to get out of that COVID phase and maybe for people to have a look around Queensland and see the state of affairs that we're in. Look, they are good numbers for the LNP. They're good numbers for Queensland. But look, we've got a long way to go. As you say, this is a good 12 months before the election. We've got a premier who's shown every bit, just like Andrews or McGowan, she's willing to do whatever it takes to stay in power. So they're good numbers. But does it mean the end of Labor? No, it doesn't. I think it just means things are going to get very nasty in the Labor camp.
Now, Garth, the University of Queensland is offering their Aboriginal students and staff what they call care sessions. This is special leave of up to 5 days, as well as things like safe spaces and extensions for assignments that are due, all in recognition of the stress the failure of the Voice referendum may have imposed on them. What are your feelings towards this?
Well, look, I remember when I was a university student, I certainly had a lot of stress. Didn't have too many safe spaces, though. Plenty of things going on at university that preoccupied me there. But goodness me, I can't see how this is beneficial to anybody. I don't see how this isn't a continuation of the division that is the problem in the first place. The thing that we were warning the government about, the very issue at hand, the division that this referendum would cause. Look, this is in the government's hands completely. This is what they did. This is what they wanted. They were warned not to do it, and they did it. But do we need to take special time off for this? No. No, I think actually this is the most important time in Australian politics. We need to get together. We need to get together and get over this and look at the things that unite us, the things that are far more important, Rita, that are things we share together as Australians. Taking this time out, that's not going to help that. It's not going to help anybody.
Well, I think it's also really a patronising message to be sending to your Aboriginal students and staff and the wider community, suggesting that they're so fragile that they need time off work or extensions on their projects because of the referendum result, and also presuming that they voted yes uniformly when we know that's just simply not the case. Now, before I let you go, you're attending the ARC Alliance for Responsible Citizenship Conference, along with many other solid Australians. Tell us about what this conference is all about and where Australia fits in.
Well, it's great to get together with centre-right friends from around the world, the UK, the US. Good to see there's still a few of them in New Zealand now, Rita. Good result there for us. Not so good in their rugby.
A few more now.
My New Zealand friends. But Yeah, look, it's great to come together because there's a lot going on and there's a lot happening in politics around the world that I think Australia needs to understand its role in. Look, we've seen, obviously, the Ukraine situation. Now we've got Israel. It's important we stand together. We're all seeing inflation around the world. I think it's really important now, really, we come to a point where we take a centre-right approach to dealing with inflation. And, what might have been right during COVID is no longer the answer. Spending in Australia is higher now than it was pre-COVID. I don't think anyone would agree that's the right thing, but it's up to centre-right governments, centre-right parties around the world to lead the way on that, and that's part of what we're doing here.
Garth Hamilton, thank you so much for your time this evening. We appreciate it. Now, I want to talk about the terrifying pro-Palestinian and sometimes just pro-Hamas protests that have erupted right across the world over the weekend. There were tens of thousands filling the entire length of College Street in Sydney's largest pro-Palestinian protest to date. In London, more than 100,000 marched, and we saw overnight terrifying scenes in Russia, in Dagestan, which is a devoutly Muslim area of the country. The airport was invaded as mobs looked for Jews to attack. Joining me to discuss this is President of the Australian Jewish Association, Dr. David Adler. David, welcome. Thank you for your time. What's your reaction to what you're seeing? How does the Jewish community in Australia feel about what's happening and what's happening right here at home?
Rita, thank you very much for putting a spotlight on this issue. It's dreadful. We have seen an eruption of antisemitism across the world, and some people are actually saying that this is reminiscent of the pre-Holocaust period where in Germany and other parts of Europe Jews were hunted. It's a dreadful situation, and the scenes in Russia at Dagestan certainly resemble that, where they were breaking through doors, looking through the airport, simply because a flight had landed from Israel into Russia, and so they wanted to go and get the Jews. On a smaller level, we've actually seen this on the streets in Sydney and Melbourne. There have been death threats in Sydney, in the eastern suburbs. There's been a carload of guys of Arab, Middle Eastern appearance who were rolling down the window saying, where are the Jews? In other words, they were hunting Jews in Melbourne. There have been some arrests. There have been threats at beaches, Watson's Bay and Bondi. And I can tell you that our organisation has received dozens of threats online and through social media. We're in close contact with the anti-terrorism authorities and the counter-terrorism police, reporting it. The communities had to lift security precautions. I didn't think in my lifetime we'd see this in Australia. It's not Australian. It's dreadful.
Now, over in the US, there's footage of Broadway producer James L. Simon, who was caught tearing down Israeli hostage flyers in New York City. The hatred that would go towards doing that is just beyond me, David. I mean, these are pictures of innocent women and children who are being taken hostage. We don't know what their fate is, and yet people are triggered by these flyers and feel entitled to deface them or just rip them up.
Well, they're not making a political statement. They're not saying that we disagree with where the borders are around Israel or anything of this nature. This is really low. I mean, what sort of morality in order to rip up flyers or posters which are only appealing for the return of innocent children? I think all civilised people need to stand with us to condemn this practice. It's extraordinary. I know that in our community, just about everybody is personally affected. Everyone has friends and family in Israel. Many of us have had people that have been harmed as a result, including me. I've lost a cousin, a young woman who was murdered at the Supernova Music Festival. I only hope that her end was quick, because some of the reports of what was done to young women are very sickening. So again, this is not what we should be seeing in a civilised democracy, and we have imported a hatred. It's a dreadful thing, and we don't want to see it on our streets at all.
Now, at a pro-Palestinian rally in Vancouver, one of the speakers there labelled Hamas's October 7 attack as an amazing, brilliant offensive. Have a listen.
A feat of determination and ingenuity, only eclipsed by the amazing, brilliant offensive waged on October 7th.
David, it's just shocking. The mask is slipping with so many. There is this virulent anti-Semitism among so many in the left, and we are seeing it, whether it's in college campuses in the US, whether it's the squad amongst the Democrats, or whether it's people of positions of influence in the UK, or you could argue even some of the Greens right here in Australia. There is just this hatred that is being laid bare.
You're absolutely right. I mean, that particular example you showed is the equivalent of being part of a cheer squad for ISIS or a cheer squad for Nazis. Hamas has demonstrated that it is on an equally low level, if not even lower, doing the most barbaric things to innocent people, the torture, the shooting, slaughter of elderly people on the street, the slaughter of children, some beheaded, some having body parts removed. There have been forensic reports which are sickening, and as you probably know, about 200 international journalists were shown some of the body cam footage. Anyone who doesn't unconditionally condemn that sort of terrorism is not fit for public office, and that frankly includes the Greens. If they can't bring themselves, regardless of their political view, to unconditionally condemn what Hamas has done, they are not fit for public office, and all political parties should put them last.
Now, David, before we go, can you bring me an update with what's happening in Dagestan? You mentioned the scenes there at the airport, just frightening stuff, mobs of enraged people looking for Jews. They even invaded the tarmac. They were questioning people, demanding to see passports and mobile phones to establish whether they were travelling from Israel, whether they were Jewish. This is just incredible that this is happening in 2023. What can you tell me about the scenes in Dagestan?
Well, I mean, they're very frightening scenes, but my understanding is that they have been cleared. They kept all passengers on the plane, and the authorities have succeeded in clearing the airport. The airport has actually been closed completely. There was some damage done to it, and it won't be reopened for about a week or so.
David, thank you so much for your time this evening. Sorry we've run out of time. Thank you for your company tonight. Don't go anywhere. The Bolt Report is up next.